Hello everyone, welcome to Audio Sleep Channel. My name is Mr. Arthur Giles, and I've lived in St. Mary Mead for as long as anyone cares to remember. It's a quiet place, usually. But even in the sleepiest of villages, sometimes a ripple disturbs the surface, and what lies beneath can be quite unexpected. Tonight I would like to tell the story of one such ripple, a tale that unfolded not so long ago, right here, during what should have been the most peaceful time of year. It's a story where the keenest eyes in our village, those of Miss Jane Marple, saw what others entirely missed. So find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and let your mind drift back with me to a time of frosty mornings, warm fires, and a mystery that unfolded under the watchful gaze of Christmas. Now, let's begin with Chapter 1 of the Christmas Mystery at St. Mary, Mead. Chapter 1. The Biting December. Air nipped at Miss Marple's cheeks as she walked the familiar path towards St. Mary Mead's ancient parish church. A light dusting of snow softened the harsh lines of the village, transforming the ordinary into something touched by magic, at least for a fleeting moment. Christmas Eve. The air hummed with a quiet anticipation, a blend of festive cheer and the solemnity of the season. Villagers, bundled in scarves and heavy coats, exchanged hushed greetings, their breath pluming white in the crisp evening. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle shifts in expression, the barely perceptible tensions that often lurked beneath the veneer of Yuletide goodwill. The annual carol service was a cornerstone of the village's Christmas traditions. Inside the old stone church, the air was warmer, heavy with the scent of beeswax polish and damp wool. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the ancient Norman arches, lending an almost mystical atmosphere. Mrs. Bantry, a dear friend, gave a cheerful nod from her pew, while young Master Giles fidgeted beside his mother, already anticipating the mince pies. Seated prominently in a front pew, almost as if he owned it, was Mr. Alistair Finch, the village's newest resident. He had arrived 6 months prior, a man of considerable wealth and an even more considerable ego, purchasing the grandest estate, the Cedars, at the edge of the village. Tonight he looked particularly pleased with himself, his silver hair immaculately combed, his suit of fine tweed impeccably tailored. During the collection he made a rather theatrical gesture, placing a crisp 5-pound note, a princely sum in those days, into the velvet bag. A collective murmur of appreciation rippled through the congregation, though Miss Marple detected a faint undercurrent of something else. Envy, perhaps? Or something less charitable? She had always found Mr. Finch's displays of generosity a trifle too ostentatious, a performance rather than genuine altruism. He seemed to derive more pleasure from the acknowledgment of his munificence than from the act itself. The service proceeded with familiar hymns and readings. Mr. Finch, despite his outward piety, seemed to Miss Marple to be more concerned with the impression he was making than with the spiritual significance of the moment. His eyes, though ostensibly fixed on the altar, occasionally darted around the church as if cataloguing the attendees, assessing their reactions. Miss Marple thought of a peacock preening. After the final blessing, the congregation slowly dispersed into the frosty night, exchanging wishes for a Merry Christmas. Mr. Finch, however, lingered, engaging the vicar in earnest conversation, no doubt about some further philanthropic endeavor, or perhaps to ensure his generous donation had been sufficiently noted. Miss Marple, allowing the crowds to thin, eventually stepped out into the quiet square. The church bells began to peal softly, a melodic chime carrying across the fields. She had just reached her garden gate, the stars like scattered diamonds above, when she heard the frantic ringing of the telephone from her neighbor's house, followed by the agitated voice of Mrs. Price Ridley. Within minutes, the news, relayed by Mrs. Price Ridley's breathless maid, spread like wildfire through the quiet streets. Mr. Alistair Finch, the man who had so grandly graced the carol service, had been found dead in his study at the Cedars. The initial report was of a sudden heart attack, a tragic end on Christmas Eve. But even as the maid spoke, Miss Marple's mind, ever alert to the nuances of human affairs, registered a subtle discord in the narrative. A man so robust, so outwardly vibrant, collapsing so abruptly? It struck her as remarkably convenient for someone. Chapter 2. The morning of Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, the pristine snow reflecting a winter sun, but the festive cheer in St. Mary Mead was decidedly muted. The news of Mr. Alistair Finch's sudden demise had cast a pall over the village. Tongues, usually loosened by Christmas spirits, wagged with a new kind of intensity. Miss Marple received a procession of visitors, each bearing not only seasonal greetings but also the latest fragment of gossip concerning the tragedy at the Cedars. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, had pronounced Mr. Finch's death as due to natural causes, a massive coronary event. This diagnosis, delivered with the doctor's usual unflappable certainty, was widely accepted, if reluctantly. After all, a man of Finch's age, and indeed his somewhat corpulent build, was certainly susceptible. However, Miss Marple observed that while Dr. Haydock's medical pronouncement was accepted, it didn't quite settle the villagers' minds. There was an unspoken disquiet, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Mrs. Garside, the vicar's wife, called with a plate of shortbread, her voice barely a whisper. Such a shock, Miss Marple, on Christmas Eve, of all nights. And poor Mr. Finch, so full of life, wasn't he? Though I did notice he looked a little flushed during the service. Mrs. Garside's flushed observation was typical, a superficial detail, yet one that Miss Marple tucked away. Later, Inspector Craddock, a distant nephew of Miss Marple's, who sometimes found her insights rather unsettling, made a brief, perfunctory visit, mainly to ascertain there was no local mischief afoot. He confirmed Dr. Haydock's findings, stating there were no suspicious circumstances whatsoever. He seemed almost relieved to conclude his official duties before the festive lunch. Yet as he spoke, Miss Marple noted his eyes darting to the window, avoiding her gaze slightly. A telltale sign of a mind not entirely at ease, perhaps wrestling with an unspoken doubt. Miss Marple, while offering her condolences and expressing suitable platitudes, listened more intently to the incidental remarks. Mrs. Finch's housekeeper, Mrs. Dixon, a thin, nervous woman who was now temporarily staying with a relative in the village, had apparently been the one to find Mr. Finch. She described him slumped over his desk, a half-empty brandy glass nearby, the fire in the grate casting a warm glow. Everything seemed perfectly natural. Yet when Mrs. Dixon spoke to Mrs. Lumley, the local postmistress, she had mentioned something else. A fleeting comment about Mr. Finch having looked oddly pale the day before, a detail that seemed to contradict Mrs. Garside's flushed observation. Miss Marple found this small, almost insignificant discrepancy intriguing. How could he be both flushed and pale in such close succession? It might be nothing, merely the unreliability of observation, but Miss Marple filed it away. Then there was the matter of Mr. Julian Blackwood. He was Mr. Finch's nephew, a rather feckless young man, known for his extravagant tastes and considerable debts. He had been living at the Cedars for the past year, ostensibly as his uncle's secretary, though his duties seemed to extend little beyond spending his uncle's money. Julian had been conspicuously absent from the carol service, claiming a migraine. He was now confined to his room at the Cedars, distraught, or so it was reported. But Miss Marple knew Julian. Distraught often meant discomfited. Mr. Finch, for all his grand gestures, was known to be a tight-fisted disciplinarian when it came to his nephew's finances. The sudden demise of his wealthy uncle would undoubtedly alter Julian's precarious financial standing, for better or for worse. The impending reading of Mr. Finch's will, scheduled for just after Boxing Day, now loomed large in the village's collective consciousness, a silent question mark hanging over the apparent naturalness of his death. Chapter 3. The Boxing Day quiet was shattered by the arrival of Mr. Nathaniel Ponsonby, a solicitor from London, whose sombre black suit seemed to absorb what little festive light remained. He was there for the reading of Mr. Alistair Finch's last will and testament, an event that, in a village as small as St. Mary Mead, often brought more drama than any theatrical production. Miss Marple, not directly involved, nonetheless received a detailed, albeit biased, account from Mrs. Bantry, who had heard it all from the vicar's wife, who had in turn received it from Mrs. Dixon, the housekeeper, now recovered enough to assist the solicitor. The assembled company at the Cedars had been a small but significant one. Julian Blackwood, looking pale and genuinely agitated; Mrs. Dixon, whose nervous fluttering seemed more pronounced than ever; and a Dr. Caldwell, a seemingly distant relation from London, whom few villagers had ever seen. The air, according to Mrs. Dixon's description, had been thick with unspoken expectation. Mr. Ponsonby had, with professional gravity, unfolded the document. The initial clauses were standard: small bequests to various charities and a comfortable annuity for Mrs. Dixon. Then came the bombshell. The bulk of Mr. Finch's considerable fortune, including the Cedars itself, was not bequeathed to Julian Blackwood, as everyone had implicitly assumed, nor even to Dr. Caldwell. Instead, it was left entirely to a Miss Eliza Finch, a previously unheard-of second cousin, currently residing in a small town in Cornwall, whom Alistair Finch had, apparently, only recently reconnected with after decades of estrangement. Julian Blackwood's reaction, as recounted, was a spectacular display of indignation. He had reportedly turned a furious shade of crimson, accusing his late uncle of cruel manipulation even from the grave. His hopes, clearly, had been pinned on an inheritance that would clear his debts and sustain his lavish lifestyle. Dr. Caldwell, though less outwardly explosive, had shown a distinct flicker of disappointment in his eyes, a brief tightening of the jaw that bespoke of frustrated ambition. He had, after all, made the arduous journey from London. Mrs. Dixon, however, had simply looked bewildered, seemingly caught between pity for Julian and a vague surprise at the unexpected beneficiary. Miss Marple, hearing this, felt a familiar stirring of unease. Such a will, so deliberately disruptive, could very well provide a powerful motive for murder, even if the death had been pronounced natural. Alistair Finch was a man who enjoyed pulling strings, even in death. This final act was entirely in keeping with his character, to orchestrate a dramatic revelation, to leave a legacy of surprise and resentment. Mrs. Bantry, relaying the details, expressed her indignation on Julian's behalf. "It's simply scandalous, Miss Marple. The poor boy had been living under his uncle's roof for a year, working, as it were. He truly expected to inherit. Who is this Miss Eliza Finch, pray tell?" "A complete stranger." Miss Marple merely nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly. She understood the sentiment, but her mind was already piecing together a different mosaic. Julian Blackwood certainly had a motive, a powerful financial one, but so too, in a more subtle way, did Dr. Caldwell, whose expectation had clearly been dashed. And what of Miss Eliza Finch? A woman who stood to gain everything, yet was unknown to anyone. Was she truly as distant and unaware as she seemed? The will had created not just one, but several potential beneficiaries and, by extension, potential suspects, where none had ostensibly existed before. The seemingly natural death of Mr. Finch was now imbued with a far more sinister potential, the threads of inheritance twisting around the circumstances of his demise. Chapter 4, the morning after the will's reading, a new peculiar detail emerged from the Cedars, adding another layer to the already thickening plot. Mrs. Dixon, still reeling from the events, returned to Miss Marple's house under the pretext of borrowing a recipe, though her true purpose was clearly to unburden herself. Her hands wrung a small damp handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began, her voice a tremulous whisper, "such a strange thing. I was tidying Mr. Finch's study this morning, preparing for Miss Eliza to arrive eventually, you see, and I noticed something quite out of place." Miss Marple offered a calming cup of tea, her gaze gentle but unwavering. "Do tell, Mrs. Dixon." "Well," the housekeeper continued, taking a shaky sip, "Mr. Finch, he was a creature of habit, you know. Very particular about his desk. Always kept it perfectly arranged. And he had this rather unusual silver letter opener. Shaped like a tiny dragon it was, with little ruby eyes. A gift, he said, from some important dignitary." She paused, her eyes wide. "It's gone, Miss Marple. Vanished. A silver letter opener?" Miss Marple mentally pictured the study, recalling what little she knew from descriptions. "Are you quite certain, Mrs. Dixon? Perhaps it was merely misplaced amongst the papers? Oh no, Miss Marple. I am quite certain. I dusted that desk every day. It always sat in its little leather stand, right beside his inkwell. And now nothing. It's not there. I searched everywhere. Drawers, floor, behind the books. It simply isn't anywhere. The disappearance of such a small, specific item was, to Miss Marple, far more telling than any grand declaration. If Mr. Finch had indeed died of natural causes, why would a letter opener be missing? Had a thief taken advantage of the confusion, or was it connected to his death? A small, valuable object might be taken by anyone, but a distinctive, perhaps even ceremonial letter opener felt more significant. It wasn't merely a piece of silver. It was an item with a story, a connection to Mr. Finch's self-important past. Mrs. Dixon continued almost as an afterthought, and there was something else, Miss Marple. The night Mr. Finch passed away, I heard a noise earlier, much earlier than when I found him. I'd gone to bed around 10, but I woke up hearing a faint clinking sound, like glass on glass or metal on glass. I thought perhaps Mr. Julian was having a late-night drink, so I didn't think much of it at the time. But now, with the letter opener gone, her voice trailed off, a fresh wave of anxiety washing over her. Miss Marple's mind was now a flurry of quiet activity. A faint clinking sound, a missing letter opener, an unexpected will, and a man pronounced dead of natural causes. The clinking could relate to the brandy glass found near Mr. Finch, but the letter opener was an entirely new and highly curious element. It suggested a presence in the study after the initial discovery of the body, or perhaps before, and then hastily removed. It was a detail that Inspector Craddock, focused on the lack of external trauma, would undoubtedly have overlooked, dismissing it as a common household item or a servant's forgetfulness. But Miss Marple knew better. In these quiet villages, the smallest deviation from the ordinary often held the greatest significance, a tiny thread in a tapestry of human deception. This missing dragon with its ruby eyes was beginning to look less like a gift and more like a crucial, silent witness. Chapter 5. Armed with Mrs. Dixon's peculiar revelations, Miss Marple embarked on a series of seemingly innocuous social calls, her preferred method of investigation. She understood that in St. Mary Mead, direct questioning often yielded defensiveness, whereas a casual conversation over tea could unlock a torrent of unguarded information. Her first stop was the vicarage, where she sought to inquire after Mrs. Garside's prize-winning holly wreath, a pretext that allowed her to gently steer the conversation back to Mr. Finch. Such a charitable man. Mr. Finch, Miss Marple remarked, admiring the wreath, always so keen to assist the church. Mrs. Garside, ever eager to share, sighed. Oh, yes, dear Miss Marple, on the surface, certainly. But between you and me, he could be rather demanding. His assistance often came with a great many conditions. He'd offer funds for a new organ, but insist on choosing the hymns for a month, or donate a clock, but demand his name be inscribed in letters so large they quite overshadowed the face. She lowered her voice further. And he had a dreadful quarrel only last month with poor Mr. Henderson, the clockmaker. Mr. Henderson had repaired his grandfather clock. You see, and Mr. Finch refused to pay the full price, claiming it still chimed too loudly for his sensitive ears, called him a common tradesman, and threatened to ruin his reputation in the village. This was new. Mr. Finch, the grand philanthropist, revealed as a petty tyrant. Miss Marple filed this away. Mr. Henderson, a quiet, meticulous man, would certainly bear a grudge, though murder seemed a leap. Next, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Price Ridley, whose sharp ears and even sharper tongue missed nothing. Julian Blackwood, that boy, Mrs. Price Ridley declared without preamble. He was practically a prisoner at the Cedars. Alistair Finch kept him on a very short leash. Julian often complained that his uncle would hold his allowance hostage, demanding he perform the most humiliating tasks, just for his amusement. He once made Julian clean out the chicken coop, gloating about it to all and sundry. Julian absolutely detested him, though he relied on him entirely. This confirmed Miss Marple's earlier suspicions about Julian's true feelings towards his uncle. His distraught state after the will's reading now seemed more like a performance of thwarted expectation than genuine grief. He had a strong motive, not only financial, but also deeply personal, a desire to escape his uncle's humiliating control. Then there was the curious case of Dr. Caldwell. Miss Marple decided to risk a direct approach, visiting the temporary lodgings of the solicitor, Mr. Ponsonby, on a fabricated matter of her own will. Casually, she inquired about Dr. Caldwell. "Ah, Dr. Caldwell," Mr. Ponsonby mused, tapping his pen. "A man of science, I believe. He was rather particular about Mr. Finch's medical history, I recall. Asked if Mr. Finch had any known heart conditions, and he prescribed medications. Rather odd, considering Dr. Haydock had already certified natural causes." He shrugged. Perhaps a professional curiosity. A professional curiosity, indeed, Miss Marple wondered. Why would a man who stood to inherit nothing, and seemingly a stranger to Mr. Finch, be so intensely interested in his exact medical status after his death? It seemed too specific, too pointed for mere curiosity. Perhaps Dr. Caldwell wasn't quite as distant or as disinterested as he appeared. The layers were beginning to peel back, revealing a far more complex tapestry of hidden motives and resentments than the simple pronouncement of a heart attack allowed. The picture of Mr. Finch, painted by the villagers, was transforming from generous benefactor to manipulative puppet master, creating enemies and disgruntled dependents in his wake. Chapter 6. The seemingly benign facade of St. Mary Mead continued to crack, revealing further complications. Miss Marple, now more convinced than ever that Alistair Finch's death was no accident, turned her attention to the timeline and the seemingly insignificant details around the night of the carol service. She recalled Mrs. Dixon's mention of Mr. Finch looking pale the day before, juxtaposed with Mrs. Garside's flushed observation during the service. A small inconsistency, perhaps, but Miss Marple's mind thrived on such minutiae. She made a point of visiting Mr. Henderson, the quiet clockmaker. He was indeed a meticulous man, his small shop filled with the rhythmic ticking of countless timepieces. He still bore a simmering resentment towards Mr. Finch. "Alistair Finch," he muttered, carefully oiling a tiny gear. He liked to think he owned everything, even the very sound of a clock's chime. Threatened to ruin me over a few shillings. Said he'd tell everyone my repairs were shoddy. Mr. Henderson's hands, though steady, trembled slightly with a suppressed anger. He had a motive, Miss Marple noted, a strong one, born of wounded pride and financial threat. But the means and the cunning? As she left the clockmaker's, Miss Marple saw Dr. Haydock's car pull up outside the local dispensary. She seized the opportunity for a casual chat. "It was such a trying time for you, Doctor, with poor Mr. Finch's sudden passing. You seemed so certain it was a heart attack." Dr. Haydock, a man of science, frowned. "And I am, Miss Marple." All the symptoms were classic. No signs of struggle, no suspicious marks. A perfectly natural, if sudden, end. He paused, adjusting his spectacles. Though I must confess he had seemed unusually agitated the day prior, complaining of indigestion, a strange metallic taste in his mouth. He thought it was merely Christmas overindulgence. I gave him a mild antacid. But these things can escalate, you see. Stress, a rich meal, perhaps a touch too much brandy on Christmas Eve. Metallic taste. Miss Marple's mental gears turned. It was a detail Dr. Haydock had dismissed as part of a common ailment, but it echoed with a peculiar resonance. Had Mr. Finch been suffering from something more than mere indigestion? And what of his agitation? Could it have been due to more than just the usual Christmas pressures? Later that day, another curious event occurred. Young Master Giles, while playing near the stream that bordered the cedars, discovered something peculiar. He brought it excitedly to Miss Marple's attention, a small, empty glass phial, no larger than her little finger, stoppered with cork. It had been partially buried in the mud near the stream bank, not far from where the public footpath ran close to the Cedars grounds. "It looks like something from a chemist's shop, Miss Marple," he chirped, holding it out. Miss Marple took the phial. It was indeed a chemist's bottle, though unlabeled. It had a faint, almost imperceptible residue inside, and a very subtle, acrid smell that her keen senses registered. This was certainly not the kind of discarded item a child usually found. It felt deliberate, hidden, and found in a location that suggested it had been deliberately disposed of, perhaps thrown away by someone walking along the path or from within the grounds of the Cedars. The presence of the file, coupled with Dr. Haydock's mention of a metallic taste and agitation, began to paint a picture distinctly different from a simple heart attack. A metallic taste, a file, and a man who suddenly dropped dead. The doctor's initial diagnosis, while medically plausible on the surface, suddenly seemed less robust, less convincing to Miss Marple. The game, she realized, was now truly afoot. Chapter 7. The small glass phial, carefully wrapped in a handkerchief, became the focal point of Miss Marple's quiet deliberations. She placed it on her parlor mantelpiece, its unassuming presence a stark contrast to the dramatic possibilities it suggested. The acrid scent, faint but persistent, stirred vague memories of poisons from old newspaper clippings and village tales of unfortunate mishaps. Her mind returned to the Christmas Eve carol service, replaying the events, observing everyone's behavior. Mr. Finch's ostentatious donation, Julian Blackwood's absence, Mrs. Dixon's nervous flitting. She recalled the specific details, the flickering candlelight, the scent of beeswax, the familiar hymns. One particular hymn, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, had been sung with particular gusto, chosen, as she recalled, by Mr. Finch himself, a surprising choice given his usual preference for more solemn carols. Then a sudden connection, seemingly out of nowhere, sparked in Miss Marple's mind. A few years ago, there had been a poisoning case in a neighboring village involving an obscure, highly potent alkaloid. The victim had complained of a metallic taste and agitation before collapsing, symptoms remarkably similar to those Mr. Finch had experienced. As recounted by Dr. Haydock, what if the phial held the key to such a substance? And what if the choice of him was not so innocuous? She decided to revisit the Cedars, this time under the guise of offering assistance to Mrs. Dixon, who was struggling with the preparations for the arrival of Miss Eliza Finch. Mrs. Dixon, grateful for the company, led Miss Marple to Mr. Finch's study, which remained much as it had been, awaiting the new owner's inspection. Miss Marple's eyes, however, weren't on the grand furniture or the expensive paintings. They were on the desk. She noticed that the half-empty brandy glass, described by Mrs. Dixon, was indeed still there, unwashed, a faint ring of residue visible at the bottom. But more significantly, she noticed a small, almost imperceptible stain on the highly polished surface of the desk, just to the side of where the brandy glass had rested. It was a dull grayish mark, easily mistaken for a blemish in the wood, or perhaps an old water stain. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed by decades of observation, told her otherwise. It looked like a very specific kind of chemical reaction, a subtle etching, not a simple spill. Then her gaze drifted to the row of books on the shelf directly above the desk. Mr. Finch, a man who prided himself on his intellectual pursuits, had a diverse collection. Among them Miss Marple noted a surprisingly old and well-worn volume titled Rare Botanical Poisons and Their Uses Throughout History. It was a curious book for a man like Finch, who seemed more interested in finance than flora, and one that appeared to have been recently handled. A bookmark, a small strip of dried holly, protruded from between its pages, the same type of holly that grew abundantly around the Cedars, and the same type Mrs. Garside used in her wreath. A botanical poison, a metallic taste, a phial, a specific, almost corrosive-looking stain on the desk, and a distinctively missing silver letter opener. The pieces, though disparate, were beginning to align in Miss Marple's mind. The natural causes were looking less and less plausible. The missing letter opener, she now surmised, was not merely stolen, but had played a crucial role. Someone had been in that study on Christmas Eve, not just to steal, but to administer something far more deadly. The subtle, quiet violence of a poisoner, cleverly disguised by the bustle and good cheer of the Christmas season. Chapter 8. Inspector Craddock returned to St. Mary Mead, albeit reluctantly, spurred by a quietly persistent letter from Miss Marple, which hinted at certain discrepancies in the Finch case. He arrived, a little flushed from the cold, to find Miss Marple in her parlor, knitting with serene concentration. She did not immediately present him with her theories, but rather with a freshly baked scone and a cup of tea. She understood that direct confrontation often hardened professional skepticism. "My dear Miss Marple," Craddock began, a hint of exasperation in his voice, "Dr. Haydock is quite emphatic, and there are simply no signs of foul play. No forced entry, no struggle, no motive beyond Mr. Julian's rather childish disappointment." Miss Marple merely smiled, her eyes twinkling. "A motive, Inspector, is a most fascinating thing. It often wears many disguises. And as for no signs, sometimes, Inspector, the absence of a struggle can be the most telling sign of all. I find that people in our village, much like the birds in my garden, behave according to very specific patterns. And Mr. Finch's demise, for all its apparent naturalness, strikes me as rather out of character." She then, quite casually, mentioned the missing silver letter opener, the faint clinking sound heard by Mrs. Dixon, and the curious little glass phial found by young Master Giles. Craddock, initially dismissive, picked up the phial, turning it over in his gloved hand. "A child's toy, perhaps, Miss Marple?" "Possibly, Inspector, or perhaps a container for something rather less innocent." And Dr. Haydock mentioned Mr. Finch complaining of a metallic taste prior to his death. "Does that not suggest anything to your trained ear?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "A metallic taste, often associated with certain substances. But the doctor found no trace during his examination. No foul play." "Perhaps, Inspector," Miss Marple suggested softly, "the method was designed precisely to mimic natural causes, to leave no obvious trace. And the timing, Christmas Eve, when everyone's attention is diverted by festivities and goodwill, is rather impeccable. Would you not agree? It offers a convenient cover for an illicit action." Just as Craddock was pondering this, a second minor accident was reported. Mr. Henderson, the clockmaker, had suffered a nasty fall, slipping on a patch of ice just outside his shop. He'd broken his arm and was now confined to bed. The villagers immediately put it down to the treacherous winter weather. But to Miss Marple, the timing was too coincidental. Mr. Henderson, a man with a grudge against Finch, was now conveniently incapacitated, just as questions about Mr. Finch's death were beginning to surface. Was it truly an accident or a subtle message, perhaps even an attempt to silence someone who knew too much, or was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Craddock, though still cautious, was visibly intrigued. The phial, the metallic taste, the unusual will, and now Henderson's fall. The threads, once disparate, were beginning to weave into a tapestry of suspicion. He decided to pay another visit to the Cedars, this time with a more forensic eye, particularly regarding Mr. Finch's study and any residues that might have been overlooked. Miss Marple had given him just enough doubt to chip away at his professional certainty, prompting him to look beyond the surface, a skill she had perfected over many quiet years. Chapter 9. Inspector Craddock's return to the Cedars, accompanied by a younger, more thorough police constable, yielded a crucial discovery that corroborated Miss Marple's growing conviction. Armed with a special reagent, the constable tested the faint grayish stain Miss Marple had noticed on Mr. Finch's desk. The results were conclusive, a chemical burn, consistent with a highly corrosive substance. It was the residue of a potent alkaloid, a derivative of a rare plant, designed to leave minimal detectable traces within the body after a short period, effectively mimicking heart failure. The metallic taste and agitation experienced by Mr. Finch prior to his death, as recollected by Dr. Haydock, now made perfect, chilling sense. The murder weapon was no longer a mystery, but the method of administration and the culprit remained elusive. Craddock, now fully engaged, began to re-interview everyone present on Christmas Eve, seeking inconsistencies. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, not content with the chemical analysis, revisited a crucial aspect, the missing silver letter opener. She had a theory, one that required a subtle test. She recalled a similar incident from her youth in St. Mary Mead, involving a local eccentric who had developed a peculiar way of serving poisonous fungi by impaling them on a silver skewer, believing the silver would somehow purify them. That memory, however grim, offered an insight. Miss Marple gently requested Mrs. Dixon to search once more for the letter opener, suggesting it might have slipped behind a particular piece of furniture, perhaps the grandfather clock Mr. Henderson had repaired. Her true intention, however, was to provide an opportunity for a particular individual to react. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Caldwell, the distant relative from London, who had been left nothing in Mr. Finch's will. He claimed to be making a final, respectful visit to the Cedars before departing for London. He looked agitated, his professional composure noticeably frayed. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I understand the police are now investigating Mr. Finch's death as something more than natural. A regrettable turn of events, I must say." "Indeed, Doctor," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "It seems some truths, like particularly stubborn weeds, will always find their way to the surface, no matter how carefully they are buried." Dr. Caldwell's eyes, usually so sharp, darted around the room. "I am merely concerned with the family's reputation. Mr. Finch was, for all his foibles, a respected man." He paused, then, as if unable to resist, he asked, "Have the police found anything definitive? Any item of evidence?" Miss Marple merely offered a small, knowing smile. "They're pursuing all avenues, Doctor, including a missing silver letter opener, which may have played a rather instrumental role." A flash of something unreadable crossed Dr. Caldwell's face. Surprise, perhaps, or a flicker of fear. He quickly recovered. "A letter opener? How utterly absurd. A petty theft, no doubt, taking advantage of the confusion. Hardly a murder weapon." But his dismissal was too vehement, too quick. Miss Marple had seen that reaction before, in villagers who were trying too hard to appear indifferent. The casual manner in which she had mentioned the letter opener had, she realized, produced a distinct reaction, quite unlike the general surprise one would expect. Dr. Caldwell, a man of science who had inexplicably shown such keen interest in Mr. Finch's medical history post-mortem, now seemed unduly dismissive of a potential clue. The missing letter opener, she now knew, was not a mere theft, nor was it the instrument of the poisoning itself. It was something far more cunning, something tied to the very identity of the killer. Chapter 10. The Christmas decorations still shimmered faintly in the village, a poignant backdrop to the unfolding darkness. Miss Marple, now fully certain of the murder and the specific nature of the poison, focused on the how and who. The chemical residue on the desk confirmed the use of a potent alkaloid. The metallic taste and agitation were classic symptoms. But how was it administered, and by whom, without leaving obvious physical evidence on the body? Her mind drifted back to the missing silver letter opener and the subtle chemical burn on the desk. She considered the items on Mr. Finch's desk, particularly the brandy glass found nearby. It had been half empty. Had the poison been mixed into the brandy? If so, why the missing letter opener and the chemical burn on the desk itself? The burn suggested something more direct, something that had been placed on the desk, not merely spilled from a glass. And then the "God rest you merry gentlemen" hymn. Miss Marple remembered Mr. Finch's surprising choice. It had a line about tidings of comfort and joy, but it was the rhythm of the carol that struck her. It was a lively, traditional tune, one often accompanied by handbells during informal carols. Handbells, and the clinking sound Mrs. Dixon had heard. Could it be? She dispatched a note to Inspector Craddock, asking him to carefully examine the brandy glass and any other drinking vessels in Mr. Finch's study for microabrasions or unusual residues, paying particular attention to the rim or inner surfaces. She also asked him to consider the nature of the missing letter opener, its shape, its ruby eyes. Craddock, now completely convinced of Miss Marple's acumen, acted immediately. His men returned to the Cedars. A detailed forensic examination of the brandy glass indeed revealed minute traces of the alkaloid inside the glass, consistent with a liquid dose. More startling, however, were almost microscopic scratches along the inner rim, inconsistent with ordinary use or cleaning. They were too sharp, too deliberate. Later, the inspector received an anonymous tip or rather a deliberately ambiguous remark from the local pub hinting at Dr. Caldwell's unusual knowledge of plants and his odd connection to Mr. Finch's past. It seemed Dr. Caldwell had not been a distant relative after all, but rather a former disgruntled business partner of Mr. Finch's in a failed venture many years ago that had ruined Caldwell's medical reputation and left him with a deep-seated desire for revenge. Finch had ruined his career. Caldwell sought to ruin his life. The puzzle pieces clicked into place for Miss Marple. Dr. Caldwell had every reason to hate Mr. Finch. He possessed the medical knowledge to devise a poison that mimicked natural causes. He had been present at the will reading, displaying a flicker of disappointment, but his true motive was older, deeper than mere inheritance. And he had asked specifically about Finch's heart condition to Dr. Haydock, seeking to ensure his method would be accepted. The metallic taste, the agitation, the chemical burn on the desk, the precise scratches on the brandy glass, it was all a meticulously planned act. The poison had not been simply poured into the brandy. It was something far more subtle, a method designed to appear accidental or self-inflicted. The specific details, once seemingly disparate, now wove into a coherent, horrifying pattern, revealing the chilling ingenuity of a killer bent on a slow, insidious revenge. Chapter 11. The drawing-room at the Cedars, stripped of its festive cheer, felt cold and stark as Miss Marple calmly assembled the key players. Inspector Craddock, looking grim but attentive, Julian Blackwood visibly nervous, Mrs. Dixon wringing her hands, Mr. Henderson, his arm in a sling, and finally Dr. Caldwell, who entered with a forced air of professional dignity, though a tremor was evident in his hands. Miss Marple herself sat by the cold fireplace, her knitting laid aside, her hands clasped, her eyes, usually so gentle, now sharp and penetrating. "We are here, as you all know," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but clear, "because Mr. Alistair Finch did not, in fact, die of natural causes. He was murdered!" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Julian Blackwood sprang to his feet, eyes wide with a mix of shock and a nascent thrill. Mrs. Dixon let out a small sob. Dr. Caldwell remained outwardly composed, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. Inspector Craddock then laid out the forensic evidence, the trace of alkaloid in the brandy glass, the chemical burn on the desk, the minute scratches on the rim of the glass. The poison, Craddock stated, was administered directly into the brandy, not merely mixed, but deliberately placed in a way that would dissolve quickly and leave minimal trace on the body. "But how?" Julian blurted, collapsing back into his seat. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Dr. Caldwell. "That, young man, is where the ingenuity lies. The poison, a rare botanical alkaloid, was, I believe, prepared in advance. And then, at the opportune moment, when Mr. Finch was distracted, perhaps by the festive atmosphere, or by the post-Carol brandy, it was introduced," she continued, her voice weaving a narrative that was both precise and horrifying. "We know Mr. Finch complained of a metallic taste and agitation prior to his death. These are classic symptoms of this specific poison. We also know of a missing silver letter opener, shaped like a dragon, with ruby eyes." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "The key, I believe, lies in the fact that certain metallic compounds, particularly silver, can accelerate the dissolution of some alkaloids, or at least help deliver them effectively in a specific, concentrated dose. The scratches on the glass indicate something thin and metallic was used to scrape the dose into the drink." Dr. Caldwell finally spoke, his voice strained. "This is pure speculation, Miss Marple, circumstantial at best." "Not entirely, Doctor," Miss Marple countered, her eyes unwavering. "You asked Dr. Haydock specifically about Mr. Finch's heart condition after his death, seeking to confirm his natural causes diagnosis. You have a background in botany and chemistry, and a history with Mr. Finch that was far from amicable. He ruined your career, did he not, Doctor? Humiliated you in a business venture years ago, undercutting your reputation?" A flicker of raw hatred crossed Caldwell's face. "He deserved it," he hissed, abandoning his pretense. "He destroyed me. He deserved to die slowly in pain, thinking it was his own failing heart, just as he enjoyed seeing me fail. And the method? Craddock pressed, leaning forward. The poison, doctor, Miss Marple explained, was, I believe, placed underneath the head of the silver letter opener, perhaps solidified into a small waxy pellet or held by a tiny amount of adhesive. You, Dr. Caldwell, visited the Cedars the day before Christmas Eve, under the guise of offering condolences to Mr. Finch for some minor ailment he had mentioned to the vicar. You sat with him in his study as he drank his brandy. Under the guise of admiring the ornate silver letter opener, perhaps even handling it to comment on its craftsmanship, you deftly scraped the prepared dose from its underside into his drink, using the thin, sharp edge of the very same letter opener. The chemical burn on the desk would have been from a small amount of the corrosive poison perhaps falling onto the polished surface as you prepared or scraped the dose. You then took the letter opener with you. Craddock concluded to dispose of it, thus removing the immediate tool and the most direct evidence, knowing it would be difficult to trace such a small, distinct item once it was gone. Dr. Caldwell, his face ashen, finally broke. He looked from Miss Marple's calm, knowing eyes to Craddock's stern gaze, the mask of composure crumbling. He slumped into a chair, defeat etched on his features. The meticulous planning, the scientific precision, the calculated revenge, all laid bare by a quiet old lady, and a few carefully observed details. Chapter 12. The quiet confession of Dr. Caldwell hung heavy in the air of the Cedars drawing-room. His motive, once obscured by professional pride, now lay exposed. A profound and bitter desire for revenge against Alistair Finch, who had, years ago, systematically dismantled Caldwell's reputation and ruined his medical career through a ruthless business maneuver. Caldwell had spent years cultivating his knowledge of rare botanical compounds, waiting for an opportunity, a chance for a perfectly executed, untraceable reprisal. Christmas Eve, with its distractions and the general assumption of natural causes for any sudden death, had provided his perverse stage. The missing silver letter opener, found later buried deep in the grounds, confirmed its role in delivering the insidious dose. Miss Marple watched as Inspector Craddock took Dr. Caldwell into custody. The doctor, no longer defiant, simply looked utterly broken, a man consumed by a long, festering hatred. Julian Blackwood, surprisingly subdued by the stark reality of murder, stared blankly into space. Mrs. Dixon wept quietly. The atmosphere was one of profound sadness, a stark reminder of the dark currents that could flow beneath the surface of even the most tranquil village life. "It is a tragedy, Miss Marple," Craddock said, shaking his head, a brilliant mind twisted by resentment. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting out the window to the snow-covered fields. "Indeed, Inspector. Human nature is a curious thing. There are some who, like Mr. Finch, thrive on controlling and belittling others, sowing seeds of resentment without ever realizing the harvest they might reap. And there are others, like Dr. Caldwell, who allow those seeds to take root so deeply within them that they become consumed by bitterness, turning to violence in a desperate attempt to reclaim what they feel was unjustly taken." She sighed gently. "The morale, I suppose, is that one must be careful with how one treats others, for the smallest slight left to fester can grow into a monstrous shadow, and even the most peaceful of seasons and the most commonplace of events can hide the most profound of human dramas. The heart, Inspector, is not merely a muscle that fails. It is a vessel for emotions, for love and hate, and it is in its hidden depths that true motives often reside. The Christmas mystery at St. Mary Mead was resolved, its layers peeled back by the meticulous observations of an elderly lady with an unparalleled understanding of the human heart. The village slowly began to recover its festive spirit, though the shadow of the events lingered, a quiet reminder that even amidst carols and goodwill, human frailty and malevolence could find a chilling expression. If you've enjoyed our exploration of the mystery so far, and if the intricate dance of clues and human psychology has captured your imagination, please do follow Miss Marple to the end of her many fascinating investigations. Her keen insights into the small dramas of everyday life often reveal the largest truths. Thank you for listening.